BRRRRRT. The sound rolled across the red plains like a physical thing, a tearing of the sky itself. A second later came the echo, distorted by heat shimmer and distance, a ghost of thunder rippling over the desert. Somewhere beyond the wavering horizon, dozens of A-10 Warthogs were carving long, brutal arcs through what had once been a dust cloud and was now something far worse. Bailey felt the vibration of it through the steel of his Challenger before he heard it again. BRRRRT. Another burst, long and savage. He sat half-exposed in the turret, desert wind whipping grit against his visor, eyes locked on the mirage-blurred wall advancing toward them. From this far out it still looked like a storm front, a rolling tide of brown and black churning across the flat earth. But he knew better. Everyone on the line knew better. That wasn't dust. That was them. 6 weeks ago, Australia had sent out a call for aid that had ripped through every secure channel on the planet. Not for disaster relief, not for bushfires, for war. For something no one had trained for and no one had believed in until the first feeds came through, cities going dark, coastlines collapsing under something that moved like a living continent. NATO had answered. Everyone had. Now Bailey was here, in a strip of hell just north of what used to be Alice Springs, manning a tank in the largest gun line humanity had ever assembled. He turned his head slowly, taking it in. To his left and right, as far as the desert would allow him to see, guns bristled from the earth. Challengers, Abrams, Leopards, Leclercs, self-propelled artillery, missile trucks, railgun prototypes still wearing factory paint, anti-air batteries dug in so tightly they looked like metallic weeds sprouting from the sand. Every NATO nation, what was left of the ADF units from Japan, South Korea, Brazil. Even some African nations had lent their support. Bailey would remember this day with disgust. Not because they hadn't come, but because they had come believing it would be enough. Like children playing with a flame, they had gathered their armies and their flags and their old certainties, not yet understanding the truth of what they faced. They still thought this was a war that could be won with steel and courage and firepower. They had no idea. BRRRRT. Another burst rolled across the desert. Bailey turned his gaze forward. The blur on the horizon was no longer a distant smudge. It was closing now, resolving into motion, into shape, a living tide pushing toward them with the slow, unstoppable patience of a rising sea. Humanity had always wondered why the universe was so quiet, why the stars seemed empty, why no one had ever answered our calls. Something had been listening, and now it had finally found them. Bailey would remember this day as the worst of his life. Not because of the noise, or the death, or even the terror, but because of the lie that had brought them here. He would curse command for it in the years that followed, for sending tens of thousands of young men and women into the jaws of something they did not understand, trying to buy back an entire continent with blood, trying to pretend Australia could still be saved. BRRRRRT. Another burst ripped across the desert. Then the sky tore open. An explosion blossomed high above the line, a sudden, silent flash against the pale blue, and one of the A-10s dropped out of it, tumbling end over end like a broken toy. A heartbeat later, another vanished in a spray of fire and debris. Then another. Bailey heard it before he saw the rest. The brigade net erupted with voices, tight, clipped, professional, the sound of trained men and women trying not to panic as the impossible unfolded. Viper 2, I've lost visual. Something just hit my wing. God, they're in the air. The words overlapped, fractured by static and strain. The Warthogs had been gods a moment ago. Now they were dying. With the air power gone, the mass surged forward. Unhindered now, it accelerated, pouring across the desert in a living wave. Without the scream of jets overhead, all Bailey could hear was the thunder of millions of legs devouring the distance between them, a sound like the earth itself being chewed apart. A new voice cut through the chaos on the net, calm, controlled, deadly. All Tango call signs lazy and prepare to fire, high explosive. Bailey didn't hesitate. Gunner, prepare to fire. Gunner ready, came the reply. Oh my God. The whisper slipped through the intercom from the gunner, thin and shaken. Steady, mate, Bailey said quietly. Stay with me. He lifted his binoculars and followed the gunner's gaze. The sight hit him like a punch to the chest. The swarm was close enough now that the individual shapes were visible, hundreds of thousands of them, a writhing sea of gnashing pincers and segmented limbs, black, lifeless eyes reflecting the desert light. They weren't charging. They were advancing with the cold, relentless certainty of something that had never known fear. All call signs. Fire! The shout tore through the brigade net and snapped Bailey back into the present. Fire! He roared. The Challenger's cannons slammed back with a thunderclap, and hundreds of others answered along the line. Shells arced into the haze in blazing streaks, vanishing into the onrushing mass. Even before Bailey could track the first impact, his gun was already reloaded. Smoke and dust swallowed the world. Fire for effect! 5 rounds! The command came hard and fast. Boom! 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 The gun line thundered like a single colossal heartbeat, hammering the desert with high explosive fury. Bailey lifted his binoculars, staring into the rolling wall of smoke, willing it to be enough. For a moment, there was nothing. Then something moved. Oh, God, Bailey whispered. The horde burst through the smoke, still coming. Fire at will! The order came screaming down the net, the panic barely hidden now. Everything opened up, cannons roared, javelins streaked skyward, heavy machine guns stitched the desert with fire. Infantry weapons joined in, 1,000 smaller cracks and flashes swallowed by the greater thunder. It was chaos. Bailey swung his mounted machine gun into the mass, firing in controlled bursts at first, just like he'd been trained. Then the swarm got closer. He squeezed the trigger and didn't let go, raking the barrel left and right as bodies tore and fell and were immediately replaced. The weapon bucked against him until, finally, click. Empty. The screams came next. As the horde finally slammed into the gun line, the radio, once filled with clipped professional commands, dissolved into raw panic and dying voices. Men and women shouting coordinates that no longer mattered. Call signs breaking apart into sobs and static. Bailey saw one of the creatures leap onto the turret of the tank to his left. The commander rose up, pistol in hand, and emptied 5 rounds into it at point-blank range. It fell. 2 more replaced it. They tore him from the hatch, dragging him away, kicking and screaming as the swarm swallowed him. A 3rd dropped into the open turret behind him. That tank's gun went silent. Bailey's world shrank to a pinprick. His heart hammered so hard it felt like it might tear out of his chest. He could just make out his crew's voices, screaming through the intercom as everything else blurred into noise and fire. "Fuck this," he shouted. He dropped into the turret and slammed the hatch closed. "Driver, full reverse!" The Challenger lurched as the engine howled, dragging them back as the line began to collapse around them. "Get us out of here," Bailey panted into the intercom. "Roger, mate," the driver replied. Bailey lifted the commander's sight and looked back. What was left of his troop was gone. Tanks and infantry were being swallowed by a wave of chitin and snapping jaws, metal and flesh vanishing beneath a living tide that didn't slow, didn't hesitate, didn't even seem to notice what it was destroying. They were being erased. Bailey's tank screamed as it tore across the desert. "Where we going, mate?" the driver asked, his voice tight. Bailey wiped the sweat from his face, hands shaking. "As far away from here as possible." For a moment, the net was dead, just static and distant screams. Then it came alive. American voices, command level, cold and fast. All units, this is Overwatch. Immediate evacuation protocols are in effect. Repeat, immediate evacuation. All remaining forces are to disengage and withdraw. Bailey closed his eyes and let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. "What is it?" the gunner asked. Bailey opened his eyes, staring at the red horizon as it burned. "We're getting out of Australia," he said quietly. "They're going to burn the whole continent. They're going to nuke it." A beat of silence inside the tank. "They're wiping it clean, lads." It took them half a day of driving to reach the evacuation zone. When they arrived, there was no ceremony, no goodbyes, just shouting and flares and soldiers being herded into waiting C-17s. They were ordered to leave everything behind: tanks, weapons, the last scraps of a defense that had failed. Inside the cargo hold, they were packed together like freight. When the aircraft finally lifted, Bailey found a narrow view through the rear ramp. Far below, the dust cloud of the horde was already swallowing the evacuation zone. Then the sky flashed. One, then dozens. Orbital fire. They hadn't even waited for the last transports to clear the ground. Bailey closed his eyes as Australia burned. Bailey was older now, sitting alone in his armchair, remembering that day. How stupid and naive they had been, and how much more the human race would have to bleed because of it. He rose and walked to the window, staring up at the night sky. "At least we finally found out why no one out there ever talked to us," he murmured, "because anything that didn't survive."